I step into the kitchen and stop cold. My daughter Abigail has her hand pressed to her cheek. Her husband, Mark Vance, stands 2 feet away, already composed. His mother, Beatrice, sits at the breakfast table, sipping tea, watching with the calm of someone who has seen this before. That's how a Vance man keeps order, Beatrice says pleasantly. A wife should be grateful. My name is Kate Sterling. I'm 60 years old. For 31 years, I was the person corporations called when money went missing and no one could prove it. I find things people try to hide. That's all I've ever done. What did you just do? My voice doesn't shake. It never shakes. She slipped, Mark says. You're overreacting, Kate. Abigail. I look at my daughter. Get your coat. She's not going anywhere, Mark says. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. I wasn't talking to you. I pull out the 401k statement, my retirement account, drained without my knowledge, signed with my daughter's forged name. I find things people try to hide. That's all I've ever done. They had no idea what was coming next. The rain came in sideways off Puget Sound that Thursday morning, the kind of rain that didn't ask permission, it simply arrived and rearranged everything. Kate Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office on the 14th floor of Callaway and Associates, watching the gray water of the Sound disappear behind a curtain of cloud, and she thought, as she sometimes did on mornings like this, that Seattle had never quite decided whether it wanted to be beautiful or brutal. Today, it had chosen both. Behind her, the office was quiet in the way that only Thursday mornings could be. The open-plan floor beyond her glass partition hummed with the distant percussion of keyboards and the soft murmur of colleagues settling into their second cups of coffee. Kate had already finished her first. She hadn't tasted it. In her left hand, she held a piece of paper that had no business being in her hands at all. It was a 401k quarterly statement, her own, from the retirement account she had been carefully, methodically building for 31 years. She knew the figures on that statement the way a sailor knows the depth of a familiar harbor. She had checked them in March when the market dipped. She had checked them in June when it recovered. She knew, without having to think about it, what the balance should read on the second Thursday of November. What it read instead made her hand go very still against the paper. The withdrawal figure was not a rounding error. It was not a clerical mistake. It was $247,000, processed in 3 separate transactions. Across 6 weeks, and signed, or rather, authorized through a signature that was meant to resemble a signature in the name of Abigail Marie Sterling. Her daughter's name. Kate set the paper down on her desk with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has spent 3 decades learning that the first response to a shock is never the right one. She pressed the tips of her fingers against the cool surface of her mahogany desk and breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. And let the professional part of her brain, the part that had interviewed 400 candidates, investigated 19 internal fraud cases, and terminated the employment of a CFO who had been stealing from the pension fund for 8 years, let that part step forward and take the wheel. The signature was wrong. She could see that immediately, and she had not even been looking for it. She had simply known. The loop on the lowercase g in Abigail's name turned inward when Abigail wrote it. This signature's loop turned out. The cross on the T sat too high. The pressure on the pen was uneven in a way that suggested the writer had been copying rather than signing, studying a model and reproducing it, which was a subtly different motion than the automatic, muscle memory movement of a person writing their own name. Kate had seen forged authorization forms before. She had presented 3 sets of them to corporate legal counsel in the span of a decade. She knew what she was looking at. She also knew that the person whose name was forged on this document lived 12 minutes away in a house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, and that Kate had last seen her 6 days ago, on the Sunday evening that now sat in her memory like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. The dinner had been Abigail's idea, or had been presented as Abigail's idea, which Kate had long since learned was not always the same thing. They had sat in the dining room of the Laurelhurst house. The 3 of them, with the good china that Abigail had bought herself before the marriage and which now appeared only on evenings that were meant to signal normalcy. Mark had been animated, expansive, moving his hands as he described the progress of his company's Series C funding round. He was the kind of man who filled a room not by being loud, but by making the air around him feel slightly thinner, as though his presence consumed something that other people needed. Kate had watched him the way she always watched him, with the professional, unreadable attentiveness that her former employees had called her poker face and her daughter had once called, laughing, Mom's HR mode. She had been in HR mode since the second month of Abigail's marriage to Mark Vance. She had never quite been able to turn it off. What she remembered most sharply from Sunday's dinner was not anything Mark had said. It was the way Abigail had kept her sleeves down. The evening had been warm, one of those late autumn Seattle evenings that holds a residual summer warmth in the indoor air even as the temperature outside drops, and Abigail had been wearing a cream-colored blouse with long sleeves that she had not rolled up once throughout the meal. She had not pushed them back when the steam from the soup rose toward her face. She had not adjusted them when she reached across the table for the bread. She had kept them pulled down, with a small, habitual downward tug of her fingers that Kate had seen twice before, and had not, in those previous moments, allowed herself to understand. She understood it now. She turned from the window and looked at the second document on her desk. This one she had not found in a company file or a financial system. She had found it 3 weeks ago at the bottom of Abigail's purse, when Abigail had asked her to find a pen. And Kate had reached in past a lip balm and a crumpled receipt and a set of house keys that still had the old keychain from Abigail's college apartment. A small wooden disc with a painted daisy that was now rubbed nearly smooth. The mortgage notice had been folded into quarters and pushed to the very bottom, as though Abigail had been trying to make it smaller by folding it more times. 3 months in arrears. On a house that Mark's company had purchased in a neighborhood where 3-month arrears represented a number that should have been impossible, given what Kate knew or had believed she knew about their finances. She sat down slowly in her chair, the leather giving its familiar soft exhale beneath her weight, and she looked at both documents side by side. In her career, she had been handed evidence of human dishonesty in many forms. Inflated expense reports, falsified credentials, manipulated performance reviews, outright theft dressed up in the language of accounting. Every case had its own particular ugliness. Every case had a moment where the pattern became visible, where the individual data points resolved into a picture that was not ambiguous, only unwanted. This was that moment. She thought about the 31 years she had spent in human resources, first as a coordinator in a mid-sized logistics firm in Tacoma, then as a generalist, then as a manager, then as the director of HR for 2 different Fortune 500 companies before taking the role at Callaway. She thought about the thousands of interviews she had conducted, the hundreds of terminations she had handled, the 19 internal investigations she had led. She thought about the CFO who had looked her in the eye and lied with perfect composure until she put his own emails on the table in front of him. She thought about the fact that she had spent 31 years learning to identify predators in professional environments and had somehow, across the 6 years of her daughter's marriage, failed to identify one in her own family. The rain pressed against the glass behind her. A gull screamed somewhere above the sound, invisible in the gray. Kate Sterling reached out and picked up the 401k statement again. She looked at the forged signature. She looked at the withdrawal amounts. She looked at the dates. "I've fired CEOs for less than this," she said quietly, to no one. In particular, to the empty office and the rain-blurred window and the HR certificate in its frame on the wall. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. But somewhere beneath the professional calm, beneath the 31 years of practiced, deliberate self-possession, something had shifted irrevocably. The way a geological fault shifts invisibly, silently, and with consequences that will not announce themselves until the ground is already moving. She set the statement down. She picked up her phone. She had some calls to make. The Vance house in Laurelhurst sat on a corner lot 3 blocks from the lake. The kind of property that announced its own importance through understatement, no ostentatious gate, no aggressive landscaping, just clean lines and tall windows and the quiet confidence of a house that knew what it cost. Kate had driven past it hundreds of times in the 6 years since Abigail and Mark had moved in. She had sat at that dining room table for birthday dinners and holiday meals and the occasional Sunday supper that was always, in some way, She could never quite articulate to herself, slightly too formal to feel like family. She arrived that Friday evening having said nothing to Abigail about the statement. She had spent 24 hours thinking about how to approach it, running through the variables. The way she ran through variables before a difficult termination meeting, mapping the emotional terrain, anticipating the deflections. She had decided that she needed to see Abigail's face when she arrived. She needed to read the room before she opened the file. What she found when Abigail opened the door was a woman who had ironed her blouse and put on lipstick and arranged her features into a smile that was technically correct. In every detail and emotionally absent in every way that mattered. "Mom, you didn't need to bring anything. It's just wine," Kate said, stepping inside, pressing her cheek briefly against her daughter's. Over Abigail's shoulder, she could see Mark at the far end of the open-plan living room. His back to them, phone pressed to his ear, the particular tense stillness of a man conducting a conversation he did not want overheard. The dining room was set with the good china again. Candles, the kind of effort that, in another context, would have signaled celebration. Dinner began pleasantly enough, by the specific, exhausting definition of pleasantness that Kate had come to associate with meals in this house. Conversation that moved and never arrived anywhere. Mark was talking about the IPO. He had been talking about the IPO, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 years. And he spoke about it the way some people speak about a religion, with the absolute certainty of a man who has decided in advance that the outcome will confirm everything he already believes about himself. The Series C had closed. The roadshow was being scheduled. The valuation, he said, was going to reset the conversation about what Pacific Northwest Tech could produce. Kate listened. She ate. She watched Abigail, who was eating slowly and carefully, the way a person eats when they are concentrating on appearing normal rather than on the food itself. The wine glass broke without warning. Abigail's hand had simply stopped holding it. That was how it looked, not a sudden movement, not a startled flinch. But a small, momentary failure of grip, the kind that happens when a person's mind is somewhere else entirely and the physical world briefly stops receiving signals. The glass tipped, struck the edge of the plate, and shattered against the table with a sound that hit the air like a gunshot in the quiet room. In the half-second of silence that followed, Kate watched Mark's face. She had interviewed sociopaths before. Not diagnosed ones. The clinical designation rarely appeared on a personnel file, but the functional kind. The ones who wore the costume of normalcy with skilled, tireless precision and whose mask slipped only in moments of unexpected provocation. Moments they hadn't had time to prepare for. She knew what that slip looked like. She had seen it in a senior VP who had, for a fraction of a second, let his contempt show when a junior employee interrupted him, and in that fraction of a second, Kate had understood something about him that 6 months of reference checks had not revealed. She saw it now on Mark Vance's face. It was there for less than 2 seconds, the smile gone, the warmth gone, the gracious husband performance gone. Replaced by something cold and flat and utterly without affect, the expression of a man looking at a problem rather than a person. Then it was over. The warmth came back. The smile returned. He was reaching for his napkin, already in motion, already converting the moment into something manageable. But his hand, when it found Abigail's arm, did not move like a comforting hand. His fingers closed above her elbow with the careful, measured pressure of a man who knew exactly how much force he was applying, and had calibrated it to a level that would not leave a mark above the sleeve line. Abigail did not make a sound. She did not flinch. She had been trained out of flinching. That, more than the grip itself, was what turned Kate's stomach to ice. He leaned toward her daughter and said something. Kate was across the table and the words were below the threshold of hearing. But she watched Abigail's color drain the way water drains from a bathtub, suddenly, completely, leaving nothing behind. Kate's eyes moved to the side table near the kitchen doorway, where a stack of mail had been set with the automatic, habitual gesture of a household that has stopped caring whether things are put away. The top envelope was open, its contents partially visible, the header of a medical insurance explanation of benefits form, and beneath it, in the clinical, impersonal font of an insurance document, the phrase "multiple claims accidental injury" was visible above a list of dates. 4 dates. In 11 months. She looked back at the table. Mark had released Abigail's arm and was reaching for his wineglass with the easy movement of a man who had resolved a minor inconvenience. Abigail was picking up the larger pieces of broken glass with fingers that weren't quite steady. "Mark," Kate said. Her voice, when she heard it, surprised her not because it was loud, but because it was so completely quiet. "Let go of her." He looked up. He held her gaze for exactly the length of time needed to communicate that he was choosing to comply rather than being required to. Then he sat back and laughed, a short, easy laugh that contained not a single authentic syllable. "Kate, relax. She startled me, that's all. Abby knows I'm stressed about the roadshow." He picked up his wine. "It's just tension." Abigail did not look at Kate. She was looking at the tablecloth, at the wine that had spread across the white linen like a slow stain. "Tension," Kate repeated. "It's fine, Mom," Abigail said. Her voice was very careful. "It's fine." Kate looked at her daughter's face, the lipstick slightly uneven at the left corner now, the careful blankness that had replaced the careful smile. And felt a grief so precise and so specific that it had the quality of a diagnosis. This was not the first time her daughter had said those words. This was not the first time her daughter had said them without meaning them. What was new, what was different, was that Kate could see, in this specific moment, the entire architecture of the lie her daughter had been living inside of the structure of it. The load-bearing walls, the exits that had been quietly, methodically sealed. She picked up her own wine glass. She held it with both hands. "I told myself it was just a bad day." The thought moved through her with the flat, merciless clarity of an internal audit. The EOB on that side table said otherwise. 4 claims in 11 months. Accidental falls. The sleeve she hasn't pushed up all evening. She looked at her daughter. "Abigail," she said softly. "Show me your arm." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds. Mark broke it with another laugh, louder this time, more performative. The sound filling the room the way his presence always filled rooms, not through warmth but through displacement. "Okay, I think we've had enough drama for one Friday," he said, and pushed back from the table. "I'll get a towel for the tablecloth." He walked toward the kitchen with the unhurried, proprietary stride of a man moving through space that belonged to him. Abigail watched him go. Then she looked at Kate. And in the 3 seconds before Mark returned, Kate saw something in her daughter's eyes that she would not forget, not fear, exactly, and not a plea. But something that sat precisely between the two, the expression of a person who has been waiting, for a very long time, to be seen. Kate reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had already begun building the file. She had not planned to be in the kitchen. That was the thing she would return to. Afterward, the randomness of it, the way the worst moments rarely announce themselves, but simply arrive through the ordinary, unremarkable door of an ordinary, unremarkable moment. She had gone to the kitchen to help with coffee. That was all. The sound reached her before she crossed the threshold. It was a specific sound, flat and percussive and entirely unambiguous, and it stopped Kate's feet as effectively as a physical wall. For 1 full second she stood in the hallway outside the kitchen doorway, her hand not quite touching the frame, and the professional part of her brain, the part that had spent 30 years managing the distance between observation and reaction, performed its last useful function by saying, "Be certain before you move." She moved. Abigail was against the kitchen island, her right hand pressed to her cheek. Her body curved inward with the small, automatic contraction of a person absorbing an impact they have absorbed before. Mark was to her left, his posture already normalizing, shoulders dropping, hands loosening in the rapid, practiced de-escalation of a man who has learned to cycle through rage and recovery so efficiently that the recovery seems, to anyone who arrives even a few seconds late, like the baseline. Kate's eyes took in the room in the way they had always taken in rooms that contained something she needed to understand. Comprehensively and quickly, the way a camera takes a photograph. What she did not expect was what she found in her peripheral vision on the right side of the kitchen doorway, where the small breakfast table sat beneath the window overlooking the back garden. Beatrice Vance was seated at that table with a cup of tea cradled in both hands, her posture composed, her expression one of settled, mild attention, the expression of a woman watching a television program she had seen before and found largely satisfactory. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of pewter and a strand of pearls that Kate recognized from the wedding photographs. And she was, with the absolute unhurried elegance of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing, watching her son. She had not been at dinner. Kate had not seen her car in the driveway. But she was here now, in this kitchen, with her tea and her pearls and her expression of calm approval. And that fact rearranged everything Kate thought she understood about the dynamics of this house. Beatrice's eyes moved to Kate's face. She did not look surprised. She did not look uncomfortable. She looked, if anything, faintly amused, the amusement of someone whose privacy has been intruded upon by a lesser person. Kate, she said, with the particular warmth of a woman who uses warmth as a precision instrument. I didn't hear you come in. Beatrice. Kate's voice was a flat surface. What just happened? Mark turned. The normalization of his posture was complete now. He was fully reassembled, the mask back in place. With the practiced speed of a man who had spent his entire adult life in close proximity to an audience that required the performance. He leaned against the counter with an ease that was entirely calculated. Abby slipped, he said. She caught herself on the island. She's fine. She didn't slip. The words sat in the kitchen air without decoration. Abigail had not moved from her position against the island. Her hand was still at her cheek. She was looking at the floor with the specific, deliberate focus of a person who has decided that the floor is the safest place to put their eyes. Beatrice set her teacup down in its saucer with a small, delicate sound. Mark has always been very hands-on, she said, in the tone of a woman offering a helpful clarification. That's how he was raised. Some men show their feelings with words. Mark shows his with intention. She paused, tilting her head slightly. That's how a Vance man keeps order, Kate. You might not be familiar with the concept, but in this family, we believe that a man who cares enough to correct his wife is a man worth keeping. A small, thin smile. Abigail should be grateful that he cares enough to stay engaged. She said it the way a judge delivers a ruling. With finality, with the assumption of authority, with the implication that the question had already been decided and the room should now adjust accordingly. And then, with the extraordinary, practiced audacity of it, she lifted her teacup and took a sip. Kate felt the room reconfigure itself around a new understanding. She had known that Beatrice was a difficult woman. She had known this from the first meeting, 3 months into Abigail's relationship with Mark. When Beatrice had arrived at a restaurant in Bellevue 40 minutes late and spent the dinner distributing attention with the deliberate inequity of a woman who understands that attention is a form of power. She had been charming and cutting in equal measure, the cuts always delivered with the plausible deniability of a compliment. She had looked at Abigail the way a buyer looks at a purchase they are not entirely satisfied with but have decided to accept. Kate had catalogued all of this. She had filed it in the part of her professional mind labeled difficult and law dynamics. Monitor and manage, and she had managed it. She had maintained the cordial distance of two women who respect the boundary between them without warmth. What she understood now, watching Beatrice replace her teacup in its saucer with the finality of a gavel, was that she had fundamentally misread the situation. She had been monitoring a difficult woman. She had not been tracking the architect. Behind Beatrice, tucked against her side between her hip and the arm of the breakfast chair, was a document. Kate could see only the top edge of it, blue cover stock, the kind used for legal filings. And a partial header that she could not fully read from where she stood. Beatrice's right hand rested against it with the casual possessiveness of a person covering something they don't want. Noticed by making the covering look accidental. A power of attorney document. Kate could see enough of the format to know the category, if not the specifics. And the casual concealment of it, the practiced nonchalance of that covering hand, told her something more important than the document's specific contents. Beatrice had brought it to this house tonight. She had not left it somewhere. She had brought it here and was holding it and had positioned herself in this kitchen, not the living room. Not a guest bedroom, and she had watched her son strike his wife across the face and she had applauded it. Not metaphorically, actually, physically applauded, with the small, measured appreciation of a woman applauding a student who has demonstrated a skill correctly. Kate understood, with the cold precision of a person whose professional life had been spent mapping the architecture of human dishonesty, that she was not looking at a difficult mother-in-law and a volatile son-in-law. She was looking at a system. She was looking at the hub and the spoke. She was looking at the thing that had been operating, with apparent impunity, in the house where her daughter lived. Abigail, Kate said, very quietly. Get your coat. She's not going anywhere, Mark said, with the easy certainty of a man who has never had that particular sentence challenged. Kate looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the CFO with the pension fund documents on the table between them. With the specific, patient focus of a woman who already knows how the meeting ends. I wasn't asking you, she said. She reached into her pocket. Her phone was there, and her fingers closed around it with the instinctive grip of a person reaching for the one tool they know how to use. She was not going to call anyone tonight. She was not ready for that yet. But the weight of the phone in her hand felt like the weight of something that would matter later, evidence in an investigation she had not yet formally opened, but had, in this kitchen, in this moment, already decided to pursue. Abigail finally looked up from the floor. Her hand had dropped from her cheek. The redness was deepening to something that would become a bruise by morning. And she was looking at Kate with an expression that was complicated in ways that Kate could not fully decode in this moment. Shame, yes, and fear. But beneath both of those, something else. Something that had been buried for a long time under the weight of the first two. Mom, Abigail said. The word came out very quietly, with a tremor in it that Abigail tried to control and could not quite. I'm here, Kate said. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't anything, yet, except the most important thing she could offer in this specific moment: the simple, irrefutable fact of her presence. She was here. She had seen. And the system, which had been operating in the confident assumption of invisibility, had just been observed by the one person in Abigail's life who had spent 30 years learning exactly what to do with what she had seen. The call from her bank came at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the kitchen. Kate had been awake since 5, which was not unusual for her. She had been a 5 o'clock person for most of her adult life. The early hours belonging to the quiet, systematic kind of thinking that the rest of the day rarely permitted. She had been at her kitchen table with her laptop and a yellow legal pad, working through the notes she had begun compiling after leaving Abigail's house that Friday evening. She had a list. She had dates and documents and the beginning of a timeline that she was mapping with the same methodical, reference-checked precision she brought to any internal investigation. She had, in fact, been feeling something she recognized as momentum. It was a familiar feeling, the quiet, internal gathering of purpose that preceded every serious case she had ever built. The feeling that the variables were resolving, that the picture was becoming legible. The bank's automated system informed her that her account access had been restricted, pending resolution of a legal injunction filed in King County Superior Court. The system offered a case number and a phone number for the legal department. The system's voice was entirely neutral about all of this. Kate set the phone down on the table very carefully, in the way that a person sets something down when their hands are not entirely reliable. She sat for a moment looking at the legal pad. She looked at the neat, organized columns of dates and document references that she had spent 3 mornings building. She looked at the yellow paper and the blue ink and the small, systematic architecture of the case she had been assembling. And she thought about the fact that in the 48 hours she had spent building it, Mark Vance had apparently filed a legal injunction against her bank accounts. Which meant he had known. He had known she was building something, or he had anticipated that she would, and this was the possibility that sat in the room with her now like a third presence. He had already had this prepared before she arrived at that kitchen doorway on Friday evening. Before she had said a single word. Before she had shown a single card. She picked up her laptop and opened a search tab for the King County Superior Court Public Records portal. What she found there required her to sit very still for a long time. The injunction was real. It had been filed on the basis of a fraudulent document, a loan guarantee that bore her signature, or a signature presented as hers, on a commercial credit line that Mark's company had drawn against a property that was, according to the filing, partially secured by her own home in Montlake. The filing included what purported to be her signed authorization as a co-guarantor of a loan for $850,000. That she had never seen, never signed, and never agreed to. She went to the second tab she had open, the one with her mortgage servicer's portal. The foreclosure notice had arrived in paper 3 weeks ago. She had found it in the mail and had looked at it with the incomprehension of a person encountering a document that contradicts something they know to be true. The way you look at a photograph of yourself at a place you have never been. Her mortgage was current. Her payments were automated. The notice had to be an error. It was not an error. According to the servicer's records, her property had been placed as collateral on a secondary lien filed through a commercial credit instrument 8 months ago. And the payments on that secondary lien had not been made. And the resulting default was triggering foreclosure proceedings that encompassed the primary mortgage as well. The lien documents showed an authorization signature. Her authorization signature, which she had not written. She closed the laptop slowly and pushed the legal pad to one side and sat in her kitchen, in the house she had purchased 17 years ago. In the neighborhood she had chosen for its nearness to Abigail's school, and she looked at the wall, where her framed HR certification hung in its dark wood frame with the gold seal of the state board and her full name in the clean, formal typography of official documents. Catherine Ann Sterling, Director of Human Resources. The rain against the kitchen window was heavy this morning, the way Seattle rain is heavy in November. Not violent but persistent, the kind of rain that doesn't intend to stop. It pressed against the glass with a steady, low sound that was almost, but not quite, peaceful. I am 60 years old, she said, to the empty kitchen, to the rain, to the HR certificate. And the closed laptop and the yellow legal pad with its careful columns that had not been careful enough. And I have nothing left. Her voice cracked on the last word. It was the first time, in the 4 days since the kitchen, that anything in her voice had cracked. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound you did not intend to make, with a slight, involuntary surprise, and then with something more complicated. She got up. She moved through the kitchen with the deliberate, contained movements of a person who has decided that movement is preferable to stillness. And she went to the small hallway off the kitchen that connected to the back staircase. And she stood for a moment in the doorway of what had been Abigail's room when Abigail still lived here, which she sometimes used now as a second office and sometimes did not enter for weeks at a time. She had been here 2 days ago, looking for a phone charger. She had found, on the dresser, a pill organizer. It was a standard 7-day organizer, the kind sold at every pharmacy, with the days of the week printed in faded letters on each compartment lid. It had been pushed to the back of the dresser, half hidden behind a candle and a photograph from Abigail's college graduation. The photograph showing Abigail in cap and gown, laughing, one arm around Kate, both of them squinting in the June sunlight outside the UW quad. Kate had taken that photograph with her when she'd cleaned the room for the guest room conversion. But it had apparently come back somehow, returned to this dresser, and was now sitting in front of a pill organizer that contained not the vitamins or blood pressure medication of the type Kate might have expected, but small white tablets in 2 of the compartments, tablets that Kate had taken a photograph of with her phone. And had, that same evening, run against a pharmaceutical reference database that confirmed what her instinct had already told her. Sedatives, mild enough to be plausible as sleep aids, consistent enough in their dosing to suggest administration on a schedule rather than as needed. She stood in the doorway and looked at the dresser and the pill organizer and the graduation photograph, and she thought about her daughter at 22 in that June sunlight. Laughing that particular unself-conscious laugh that Abigail had, the one that came from the belly. The one that meant nothing was wrong, and she thought about the woman she had seen 4 days ago pressed against a kitchen island with her hand at her cheek, looking at the floor. The distance between those 2 images was 6 years and $850,000. And a forged signature on a loan guarantee and a pill organizer with sedatives and a medical EOB showing 4 accidental injuries and a power of attorney document held against a hip in a kitchen chair. She walked back to her kitchen table. She sat down. She opened the laptop again. She looked at the HR certificate on the wall. They had not taken that. They had taken the accounts and the house equity and the retirement fund. And the sense of security that 60 years of careful, disciplined living had been meant to produce. But they had not taken the 31 years of experience that the certificate represented. They had not taken the knowledge of how systems fail, and how documentation is falsified and where the gaps appear in the architecture of institutional dishonesty. They had not taken the particular, finely calibrated competence of a woman who had spent 3 decades finding what people tried to hide. She opened a new document on her laptop. At the top, she typed a title in plain, unembellished capital letters. Then she began to type, "I will not disappear." Friends, we're halfway through Kate's story, and if you've been holding your breath, I understand completely. In just 4 sequences, we've watched a woman who built her entire life on the ability to see through deception. Discover that the greatest deception was happening at her own dinner table. The forged 401k authorization. The medical forms. The bruise beneath the sleeve. And now her account's frozen, her home threatened. The full architecture of what Mark and Beatrice have built finally visible in all its calculated cruelty. Kate Sterling is 60 years old. She has spent 31 years as the person organizations call when something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. And now she is sitting in her kitchen, in the dark, in the rain. With nothing but her certificate on the wall and 31 years of knowing exactly how people like this get caught. In the second half of this story, we're going to watch what happens when the wrong person is targeted. When the predator doesn't realize until it is far too late that the woman they chose to destroy is the one person in the room who knows precisely where to look. Stay with us. Kate is just getting started. The file was 15 years old. Kate had not thought about it in a decade, maybe longer. The particular, compressed way that work memory operates, filing things not by emotional significance, but by resolution status, and this file had resolved, or had appeared to resolve, before she ever fully understood what it contained. It had crossed her desk at her previous company. A brief consultancy engagement she had taken on between her second and third director roles, involving an estate matter in Buncombe County, North Carolina, that had been brought to the attention of the county's social services office and had briefly, inconclusively, been flagged for further review. Beatrice Vance, née Caldwell. Asheville, North Carolina. The estate of Robert Halden Vance, deceased, aged 61. Cause of death recorded as cardiac event. No autopsy requested, no autopsy performed. Kate had remembered it 2 nights ago at 3 in the morning, the way you remember things at 3 in the morning suddenly. With the specific clarity of something your sleeping brain has been processing without permission. She had lain in the dark and thought about Beatrice in that kitchen chair. And she had thought about the power of attorney document tucked against her hip, and she had thought this is not the first time. She sat now in her home office with the digital archive she had assembled from the county's public records portal, the North Carolina Department of Revenue estate filing database, and the Social Security Administration's public death benefit records index, 3 separate systems. None of them designed to speak to each other, all of them containing fragments of the same story. Robert Vance's Social Security survivor benefit payments had processed for 4 months after his death date. And then stopped, not gradually, not administratively suspended, but stopped with the abruptness of a correction. The kind of correction that occurs when someone has been claiming payments they are not entitled to and the discrepancy is eventually noticed. The estate had been settled through a probate process that moved with unusual speed for Buncombe County. The primary asset, a property in the Kenilworth neighborhood of Asheville, valued at just over $900,000, had transferred cleanly and quickly into Beatrice's sole name. No challenge, no dispute, no co-heirs. Mark had been 22 at the time of his father's death. A college junior, he had not contested the estate. He had, according to the probate records, provided an affidavit supporting the rapid settlement timeline. Kate thought about Beatrice in that kitchen, with her tea and her pearls and her expression of mild, proprietary satisfaction. She thought about the small, measured applause. That's how a Vance man keeps order. She thought about what it meant to teach a boy that the women around him were resources to be managed, that management meant control, that control meant force. And that force was not a failure of character but an expression of it. She thought about what it took to produce a man like Mark Vance. And she thought about the specific, patient, generational investment that producing such a man required. He was raised this way. The phrase surfaced from the kitchen conversation and settled into its true meaning. Not as an excuse, as a description. She thought about Abigail. She thought about Abigail at 28, newly married, radiant with the particular happiness of a person who believes she has found something safe. She thought about what it must have been like to discover, slowly, incrementally. The way all terrible discoveries happen in small adjustments rather than one large shock, that the safety was a performance, and the performer had a director, and the director had been doing this before. The anger that moved through her was not hot. It had moved past hot sometime around 3 in the morning and had arrived at something cooler and more precise, the temperature of certainty. Rather than emotion, the temperature at which a person stops asking why and starts asking how. How does the pattern end? She had been sitting with that question for 2 days, and the answer was becoming clear in the same way that all answers become clear when you have enough data, not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece making the next one easier to find. Mark was the spoke, Beatrice was the hub. The pattern was the same: isolation, then liquidation, and the pattern required, at every stage, that the target have no external resources. No money, no allies, no documentation that could support a counter-narrative. They had moved against Kate's resources with speed and coordination that told her the move had been prepared in advance. Which told her something important: they were not improvising. They were executing a plan that had been designed before she arrived at that kitchen doorway. Which meant they had known about her investigation before it began, or had anticipated it, or had decided. And this was the version that sat most heavily with her: that she would eventually become a problem, and had prepared accordingly. She pulled up the server access log she had been reviewing and opened a new window. They had made one error. People who operate from a position of assumed dominance almost always made one error, because dominance is its own form of blindness. It assumes the terrain is known, that the variables are controlled, that the person on the other side of the equation is operating from disadvantage. They had not accounted for where Kate had spent the last 31 years. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not dialed in 4 years: a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who had been the lead forensic accountant on the pension fund case, and who owed Kate a favor she had never asked for. The phone rang twice. "Patricia," Kate said, when it picked up. "I need a friend who speaks fluent wire transfer." Patricia Nguyen arrived on a Wednesday morning with a laptop bag over one shoulder, and the focused, slightly impatient energy of a woman who has been told something interesting and is here to verify it personally. She was 53, small, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the particular bearing of a forensic accountant who has testified before grand juries, comfortable with silence, precise with words, and entirely unsentimental about what numbers mean. She set her laptop on Kate's kitchen table, accepted a coffee, and looked at the documents Kate had spread across the surface. "Walk me through it," she said. Kate walked her through it. She had been preparing for this conversation for 2 days, organizing the documents in chronological order, annotating the key anomalies, building the narrative the way she would have built it for a board presentation: clear, sequential, evidence first, interpretation last. It took 40 minutes. Patricia did not interrupt. She made notes in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, and when Kate finished, she sat back and looked at the spread of papers with the expression of a physician looking at a scan. "The 401k authorization first," Patricia said. "That's the cleanest entry point. 3 transactions, 6 weeks apart. That's a deliberate spacing pattern. Someone who understands that large single withdrawals trigger automated fraud flags, but sequential transactions below certain thresholds don't." She tapped the statement with her pencil. "This isn't impulsive. This was planned. How long ago?" The spacing pattern suggests they spent time learning the system before they moved. "I'd guess the access was established at least 4 months before the first transaction." She moved to the loan guarantee documents. "This is more sophisticated. The forgery on the commercial credit guarantee, I'd want to get a handwriting forensics opinion, but from a structural standpoint. The document itself is properly formatted, properly filed, the notarization stamp is real." She looked up. "Which means whoever prepared this had access to a cooperative notary." Kate thought of Mark's company. She thought of the administrative staff. He would have access to the people who processed his corporate paperwork, who handled his filings, who operated in the assumption that their employer's instructions were legitimate. I have the company server access, Kate said. Patricia looked at her. How? She said. I still have my HR system credentials from the consultant engagement I did with Vance Tech 18 months ago. The IT department never revoked them. Kate opened her own laptop. I know that's not standard protocol. It's definitely not standard protocol, Patricia said. She was already leaning forward to look at Kate's screen. Pull up the email archive. What they found in Mark's company email archive over the next 6 hours built a picture that Kate had known, in outline, was there, but had not yet seen in its specific, documented particularity. The emails were not encrypted and were not particularly well concealed. They were the emails of a man who had never anticipated that anyone with the relevant credentials would look for them, which was itself a form of negligence born from the assumption of impunity. There were 14 emails between Mark and a financial administrator named Terrence Boyd across a 4-month period. And they discussed, in the language of people who believe they are safe, the mechanics of the 401k withdrawal. They discussed the authorization document. They discussed the timing of the transactions. They discussed what Boyd called the signature work, which required no further decoding. There were 6 emails between Mark and a corporate attorney named Sloan, discussing the loan guarantee filing and the injunction strategy, including a message from Sloan that said, with a bluntness that Kate noted with professional appreciation, the guarantor will not be able to challenge the injunction without liquid assets, which the injunction will prevent. A self-locking system, elegant, in its way, in the cold, joyless way that a trap is elegant. Kate had set up the nanny cam on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks earlier, during a visit to the Laurelhurst house to help Abigail with a plumbing issue that had turned out to be minor. The camera was embedded in a small, unremarkable clock that she had brought as a replacement for one. Abigail had mentioned losing a white shelf clock, battery-powered, the kind that sits on a kitchen counter without attracting attention. She had placed it on the shelf above the breakfast table where Beatrice had sat. She had not been certain there would be anything to record. There was 4 recordings across 11 days. The first 2 were ambient ordinary household conversation, nothing actionable. The third was a phone call between Beatrice and a woman whose name came up twice as Sylvia, and Beatrice's portion of that call included, among other things, the sentence "the Sterling account should be fully restricted by Thursday," which gives us the window we need before she can involve an attorney. The 4th recording was Beatrice and Mark in the kitchen, 3 days ago, and it ran for 19 minutes. Kate listened to it once with Patricia beside her. She listened to it the way she had listened to difficult evidence before, without allowing the emotional content to interfere with the analytical process, which was something she had spent 30 years learning to do and which had never, in 30 years, been as difficult as it was during these 19 minutes. Beatrice's voice was exactly as Kate remembered it from the kitchen, measured, authoritative, carrying the flat assurance of a woman who has operated without consequences for long enough to have forgotten that consequences exist. She described the power of attorney document she was having prepared, which would give Mark control over Abigail's financial and medical decisions. She described the timeline for the foreclosure proceeding against Kate's property. She used the phrase clean completion 3 times, in different contexts, each time with the same tone of administrative satisfaction. Mark's responses were brief and, for the most part, agreements. When the recording ended, Patricia sat for a long moment looking at the laptop screen. "Kate," she said, "I know. This is the wire transfer evidence, combined with this recording and the forged documents. Kate, this is a federal case. The 401k theft alone crosses into federal fraud territory. The loan guarantee forgery, the coordinated financial abuse, this isn't just a civil matter." "I know," Kate said again. She was not looking at the laptop. She was looking at the kitchen wall, at the HR certificate in its dark wood frame. Her hands, resting flat on the table on either side of the laptop, were entirely still. "I want to talk to Abigail first," she said. "Before I call anyone, I want her to know what's coming." Patricia nodded. She understood, without it needing to be explained, that this was not a case. It was a family, and the woman across the table from her was not, at this moment, an investigator. "How long do you need?" Patricia asked. 24 hours. I'll prepare the financial documentation summary. You bring me the recording and the emails, and I'll have everything packaged for federal referral. Patricia closed her notebook. Kate, they targeted the wrong person. Kate looked at the certificate on the wall. Yes, she said quietly. They did. That night, she drove to a diner on the east side of Capitol Hill that Abigail had loved in college, a 24-hour place with orange vinyl booths and coffee that was not good but was reliably hot, and she sat in the booth near the window and she called her daughter's number. Abigail picked up on the second ring. Mom? I need you to meet me somewhere, Kate said. Tonight. Somewhere Mark won't know about. A pause. Long enough to contain several things at once. The diner, Abigail said. The one on 19th. Yes. Another pause. I'll be there in 30 minutes, Abigail said. Kate ordered coffee and sat with her hands around the warm mug and watched the rain move in soft curtains past the diner window. And she thought about the 19-minute recording and the wire transfer emails and the foreclosure notice and the pill organizer. And she thought about Abigail at 22 in the June sunlight outside the UW quad, laughing the unself-conscious laugh. She had 30 minutes. She used them to prepare what she was going to say, not as a script, but as a commitment. A promise she was making to herself about the precise, specific order in which she intended to give her daughter back what had been taken from her. When the diner door opened and Abigail came in, Kate stood up. The meeting was held in a conference room on the 32nd floor of the building that housed the Seattle offices of Hartwell, Sloan and Brennan, the same firm whose attorney had written, in an email that was now part of a federal evidence package, the sentence about ensuring the guarantor would be unable to challenge the injunction. Kate had chosen this particular location with the deliberateness of a woman who understands that geography is a form of message. Mark Vance arrived at 9:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled time, in the manner of a man who has been told. This is a routine compliance review, a phrase that Kate's attorney, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who had spent 22 years in white-collar criminal defense before moving to prosecution, had used in the meeting request with careful, specific intention. He was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, no tie, the studied informality of a tech executive performing approachability. He looked, when he walked into the conference room and saw the people assembled there, like a man who has arrived at what he believed was a controlled environment and has just registered that the environment is not what he expected. Eleanor Marsh sat at the head of the table. Beside her was a representative from the FBI's Seattle field office, whose name was Special Agent Dorinda Reyes, who was 41 and wearing a gray suit and had the particular, undramatic attentiveness of a federal agent who is here to observe and document rather than to perform. Beside Reyes sat Patricia Nguyen, with her laptop and her notebook and the expression of a forensic accountant who has testified before grand juries. And at the far end of the table, with a straight back, and her hands folded on the table in front of her and her face arranged in the composed, unreadable expression that her former employees had called her poker face, sat Kate Sterling. Mark's eyes moved around the table. He processed the room in the rapid, calculating way of a man whose instinct is always to assess the power dynamics before committing to a position. When his eyes reached Kate, they stopped. Kate, he said, with the warmth of a man buying time. I didn't realize this involved family. Sit down, Mark, Eleanor Marsh said, with the flat, unhurried tone of an attorney who has said those words to people far more practiced at evasion than Mark Vance. He sat. Eleanor Marsh opened the folder in front of her and began to place documents on the table. She placed them with the methodical, unhurried pace of a person who knows the room has all the time it needs. Each document landed on the table with a small, precise sound that in the silence of the conference room carried a particular weight. The 401k statement. The wire transfer records, annotated by Patricia. The 14 emails between Mark and Terrence Boyd. The loan guarantee with the forged signature, alongside a handwriting forensics report from a certified examiner that had been prepared over the previous 10 days. The loan guarantee authorization timeline. The injunction filing. Mark's face did not change dramatically. This was one of the things Kate had anticipated. That he would not break in the way that less practiced people break, with visible panic and collapsing composure. He was too controlled for that. What changed was subtler: the slight increase in the stillness of his posture, the way the conversational ease drained out of him like water draining from a vessel, leaving something harder and less mobile in its place. Today, the records will say what my daughter was too afraid to scream, Kate said. And her voice in the quiet conference room was very steady, the way the voice of a person is steady when they have been preparing for a moment for long enough that the moment no longer frightens them. Mark looked at her. You want to be careful, he said. Not loudly, almost gently, in the way of a man who is accustomed to his threats being understood without volume. I would like you to look at the next document, Eleanor Marsh said, and placed it on the table. It was the transcript of the nanny cam recording. 19 pages. Beatrice's voice, rendered in the flat, unambiguous topography of an official transcription, describing the power of attorney timeline and the foreclosure strategy and the phrase clean completion in its 3 separate contexts. Mark looked at the transcript. He looked at it for a long time. Where is Beatrice? He said. Ms. Vance is being served a subpoena at her Bellevue residence this morning, Special Agent Reyes said, in the tone of a person relaying logistical information. She's aware of this meeting. Kate watched his face through all of this with the attention she had brought to every difficult meeting of her career comprehensively, without sentimentality, reading the room as it changed. She watched the controlled stillness become something more effortful. She watched him look at the documents and look at Patricia and look at Eleanor Marsh and look, finally, back at Kate, with the expression of a man recalculating something fundamental. He had built his model of this situation on a specific assumption that Kate was a target, a resource to be depleted and a problem to be neutralized, and that the neutralization had been accomplished with sufficient speed and thoroughness that she would not be able to mount a meaningful response. He had been operating on the assumption that she was on the defensive. He had not understood, and Kate watched him understand it now. In this conference room, with this table of documents, that she had never been on the defensive. She had been on the clock. The difference was not subtle. The 401k withdrawals constitute federal wire fraud, Eleanor Marsh said. The forged loan guarantee adds bank fraud. The coordinated financial abuse of a family member, combined with the documented pattern of physical abuse. Your attorney has your documentation package. I'd suggest you read it carefully before deciding how you'd like to proceed. Outside the conference room window, Seattle spread out in the November light, the sound, the bridges, the Olympic Mountains visible for once through a break in the clouds. White and permanent and entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room. Kate looked at the view for a moment. She thought about her kitchen window and the rain and the HR certificate on the wall and the yellow legal pad with its careful columns. She thought about the pill organizer on the dresser in Abigail's old room and the graduation photograph from the June sunlight, and the long sleeves at the dinner table. She heard, rather than saw, the door of the conference room open behind her. 2 officers came in with the measured, professional unhurriedness of people executing a prepared process. And one of them spoke Mark's full name in the flat, official voice of formal process. And the other held the warrant, and Kate looked back at the table rather than at Mark because there was nothing she needed to see on his face. She had already seen everything she needed to see. The hearing of it was enough. The handcuffs made a small, mechanical sound, a precise, metallic click that was not loud, but that carried in the quiet room with the particular clarity of a sound arriving in a moment of absolute silence. The court wrote in ink, Kate thought, what my heart had been shouting in silence. She sat at the table until the room had emptied. Eleanor Marsh began gathering documents back into her folder. Patricia closed her laptop with a quiet, efficient motion. Special Agent Reyes exchanged a brief word with Eleanor that Kate did not hear. When the room was quiet, Patricia looked across the table at Kate. How are you doing? She said. Kate considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions that deserved a real answer. I'm thinking about my daughter, she said. Patricia nodded. She understood. She had always understood, which was part of why Kate had called her. She has a good mother, Patricia said. Kate looked at the table, at the rectangular impressions in the conference room surface, where the documents had been, the ghost of the case she had built and presented and completed, now cleared away by the thorough hands of process. She has herself, Kate said. That's what I wanted to give her back. Not just safety. Herself. She stood up, picked up her bag, straightened her jacket, and walked to the conference room door. She paused there for a moment, one hand on the frame, looking back at the room one more time. Then she stepped through the door and walked toward the elevator, and the November light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows and moved with her along the corridor. And the Olympic Mountains were still there through the glass, white and permanent, exactly where they had always been. The cafe had been Abigail's choice. It sat on the waterfront near the Pike Place Market, in a converted brick building that looked out over the Sound, and on a clear afternoon in late May. You could see the ferries moving between the city and the islands, white-hulled and unhurried, crossing and recrossing the blue water with the patient regularity of something that would still be doing this long after everyone watching it was gone. Abigail had discovered it 2 years ago and had mentioned it to Kate on the phone. With the particular, tentative enthusiasm of a person who is still relearning what it feels like to have small things they love. It was now the cafe where they met on the second Sunday of every month. Kate arrived first, as she usually did. She was 65 now. She had turned 65 in March, in a small dinner at her restored Montlake house. That Abigail had organized with the attention to detail of someone who takes great care of things that matter to her. There had been wildflowers on the table, which was very Abigail, and a cake from the bakery in Capitol Hill that Kate liked, and Patricia Nguyen had come with her husband. And one of Kate's former colleagues from Callaway had driven down from Kirkland. And it had been, in the specific and quiet way of genuinely good evenings, exactly what Kate had wanted. She ordered her coffee and settled into the chair facing the window and watched the Sound. The legal proceedings had concluded 14 months ago. The federal fraud case had moved with the methodical, thorough pace of federal cases, not fast, but complete. Mark Vance had entered a guilty plea on 3 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of bank fraud. The plea negotiated by his attorney in exchange for a sentencing recommendation that Eleanor Marsh had assessed as appropriate to the weight of the crimes. He was serving a 63-month sentence at a federal correctional facility in Sheridan, Oregon. Beatrice Vance had fought the subpoena for 6 weeks, through 2 attorneys, before the weight of the nanny cam recording. And the email documentation made the legal position untenable. She had ultimately accepted a civil consent judgment covering financial restitution, the terms of which included the return of the funds drawn from Kate's retirement account, the discharge of the fraudulent loan guarantee, and a permanent no-contact order with Abigail. She was living, Kate understood, in the Asheville house, the one that had moved so quickly into her sole name after Robert Vance's death. Whether she was comfortable there, or whether the house held things that pressed against her in the quiet hours, was not something Kate spent time thinking about. The foreclosure on Kate's Montlake house had been vacated as part of the legal resolution. She had walked back through the front door on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 1 year after the investigation had begun. And she had stood in the hallway with her keys in her hand and looked at the space, at the familiar geometry of the rooms, the particular quality of the afternoon light coming through the front windows, the small wear patterns in the hardwood floor from 30 years of her own daily movement, and she had felt something she had not allowed herself to feel until that moment. She had set her keys on the table by the door and gone to the kitchen and made a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window, watching the garden, and she had cried for approximately 4 minutes, which seemed to her, in retrospect, exactly the right amount of time for 31 years of professional composure to briefly suspend itself. The cafe door opened and Abigail came in from the May afternoon, slightly wind-blown, carrying a large portfolio bag over her shoulder and wearing a pale blue coat that Kate had not seen before, and when she spotted Kate at the window table she smiled the real smile, the unself-conscious one. The one that came from the belly, and Kate felt the particular warmth that she associated specifically with that smile, which was not a small thing and had never been. Sorry, the meeting ran long. Abigail dropped into the chair across the table and pushed her hair back and signaled the server. I brought it, the contract. I know, you've texted me about it 4 times this week. 3 times. Abigail pulled the portfolio from its bag. Twice. Maybe 3. The contract was for Abigail's design studio, formerly Sterling Marsh Design Studio, a partnership she had established 18 months ago with a former colleague named Jess. whose aesthetic sensibility complemented Abigail's in the specific, productive way of two people who disagree productively. They had done commercial interiors for the first year, 3 restaurant redesigns and a boutique hotel lobby that had been featured in a regional design publication. The contract now on the table was for residential development in South Lake Union, 24 units, full interior design scope. The largest project the studio had taken on. Abigail laid the contract open on the table and turned to the signature page and set a pen beside it. Her signature, when she wrote it quick, practiced, entirely assured, was large and clear and unmistakable. The loop on the lowercase g turned inward, the way it always had. Kate watched her sign and thought about a 401k statement on a Thursday morning and the cold glass of a 14th floor window. And the way the professional part of her brain had stepped forward and taken the wheel. She thought about all of it, the timeline from that morning to this afternoon. The full length of it, and she thought that the distance between those two moments was not, when you measured it in what mattered, very far at all. Abigail set the pen down and looked up. "Mom," she said, "are you okay?" "Yes," Kate said. "I was just thinking." "About?" Kate looked at her daughter's face, the easy openness of it, the way she held Kate's gaze without the habitual downward deflection that had once been as constant and involuntary as breathing. She thought about the thing she had said in the diner on Capitol Hill, on the night she had called Abigail and driven there in the rain. "I don't want to just get you safe. I want to give you back to yourself." "I was thinking about signatures," Kate said. Abigail looked at her for a moment, and then she understood not the specifics, but the direction of the thought, and something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite the other thing, but was somewhere between them, the expression of a person who has been through something and has come out the other side and is still, in the particular way of survivors, learning to live in the space where the weight used to be. "At 65, Kate said, picking up her coffee, "I finally understand that starting over isn't a failure. It's just what it looks like when you refuse to stop." The Seattle sun was strong today, the kind of May afternoon that the city produces 3 or 4 times a year. As if to justify the other 8 months, a deep, uncomplicated blue sky over the Sound, the light moving on the water in long, shifting patterns, the mountains white and clear in the west. It came through the cafe window and lay across the table between them, across the signed contract and the empty coffee cups and Abigail's open portfolio bag. Warm and entirely indifferent to the weight of what it illuminated. Kate took a sip of her coffee. Abigail reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's, briefly, the way Kate had once reached across a different table, a dinner table, a long time ago. And covered her daughter's hand without saying anything, because some gestures do not require language. "For the first time in years," Abigail said, very quietly, looking out at the water, "I signed my own name and it actually felt like mine." Kate looked at the Sound. A ferry was moving away from the terminal, white-hulled, steady, crossing toward the island in the blue afternoon. She watched it go. "Yeah," she said softly. "I know exactly what you mean. Friends, how did that one sit with you?" "I've been with Kate and Abigail through every step of this story. And I have to say there are some stories that stay with you after the listening is done, and this is one of them. Not because it's dramatic, though it certainly is, but because of what lives underneath the drama. The question it keeps asking, quietly, in the background of everything that happens. How long do we go without seeing what's right in front of us? And then what do we do once we finally see it?" Kate Sterling spent 31 years learning to see through deception in professional environments. And she still almost missed it. Because when we love someone, we often extend them a particular kind of generosity. A willingness to explain things away, to find the more charitable interpretation, to tell ourselves that a bad day is just a bad day and a long sleeve is just a long sleeve. That generosity is not a weakness. It's love, but sometimes love needs to be set aside long enough to see clearly. And the moment Kate finally set it aside and let herself see clearly, that was the moment everything changed. What moved me most about this story is not the courtroom moment, as satisfying as that was. It's the diner. It's Kate, in a vinyl booth in the rain, coffee in her hands, saying to herself, "I want to give her back to herself. Not just rescue her, not just win the case. Give her back to herself. Because that's what abuse takes, before it takes anything else, the sense of self. The belief that your name, your signature, your choices belong to you. Abigail got that back. And Kate built it, patiently, systematically, at great personal cost, with the same deliberate competence she had brought to every important thing in her life. We all face moments where we have to choose who we are. Kate chose to be the person who sees clearly and acts anyway. I hope this story reminded you that it is never too late to make that choice, no matter your age. No matter how much has been taken, no matter how long the rain has been coming down. Thank you for